So many interesting questions here, aren't there? There's the is Russia trying to influence geopolitics, which in one sense isn't a very interesting question because the answer is obviously yes. And by the way, they're not the only country trying to influence geopolitics. Famously, that is not in itself inherently a bad thing to do, but we can have views on what any country is seeking to do and what influence they're seeking to bring to bear. There's the how do they do it question, which is really interesting and will vary from place to place. And there's the question of whether it works. And certainly in relation to, for example, the Brexit debate in the UK, the US presidential election back in 2016, I think while there was some decent evidence that there were some attempts to be influential, I think the question of whether the influence actually made a difference to the material result, I think was really up for grabs. And personally, I was quite skeptical. Other people will have different views, but it certainly wasn't a slam dunk case. The Romania case is fascinating because it doesn't seem to me there's two different questions which I'd be interested in hearing your views on. A, um, you know, how important, how influential is it if you've got a bunch of TikTok accounts, social media, and so on, advocating for a candidate in a way that is not sort of authentically, organically native voters having a view? Does that matter? And even if that does have even if that has an influence on people's voting behaviour, in the end, the voters are people who have the right to vote in that country. And you count the votes and you see who wins. So, what sort of, in the end, can a court decide that, for the sake of argument, that I, as a voter, have voted for a bad reason? That seems to me to set quite a dangerous precedent, even though I think all sorts of people vote for bad reasons all the time in every country. But that is what democracy is for.
I mean, we had this in the election that we just had. There were reports of bomb threats at polling stations across the country that were reportedly called in by Russia. Basically, that made it more. I'm sure made it more difficult for people to vote. Um, I don't know. Maybe you could say it skewed voting behavior, etc. Obviously, that in and of itself does not rise to the level of, oh, our election was so is now so questionable that we can't go ahead with the result. And also, it's like, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, maybe we need more legal, jurisprudence to understand on what basis they annulled it. Some of it may not be that people voted badly, but that the playing field was tilted in a certain way, or I don't know on what basis they've cancelled it. But what's fascinating to me is, at least in India and around, we've heard for years, or the argument has been made for years, that at the end of the day, the Russian zone is declining, and really the future is going to be US versus China, right? And yet here across the world, after this big war in Ukraine that Russia supposedly ties up Russia in fatal ways, according to some, when it first happened, they seem to be able to influence things on a scale that recalls like the Cold War, and it's really fascinating to see them like being able to push this much more than China, or at least on the surface.
I guess it's both, right? Like, if you are confident that you are the next superpower, is this like, if you're confident that you're the next superpower, why would you care whether or not Georgia, which has 3 million people, joins the EU? Right? Like, it, and the fact that Assad is in Russia and not still in Damascus, I think does speak to Russia's you know, that it perhaps is not capable of doing what it once was, or thought it was. And we should also say that there was a report in the Washington Post this week: Russia's elite sound the alarm on the economy amid high interest rates. Now, you can say maybe Trump comes in and relaxes some of the sanctions and the economy improves, but I think it can both be true that Russia does not have the geopolitical heft of China, and also true that perhaps because of that, Russia is much more interested in, pretty effectively, as you say, like, trying to influence through not always the most upfront means and measures how people conduct their domestic and foreign politics.